Thank you, Meg. We're excited to be here. I'm especially excited to come back and get to share some of what I've been doing since I left. And you know, Kiki and I have worked together when she was at Purdue. At Purdue, we don't actually ever let anybody leave for good. So some of this research is stuff that we're still working on with also a former postdoc who's now in Colorado College. So I guess like once you're at Purdue, you never really escape. But today we're going to talk about how to use we're going to talk about our course transformation program and how we've used some of that data to conduct some research. So just to give you a kind of overview, I'm going to start by giving some background information on our course transformation program. And then we're going to get a little bit deeper into some of the nitty-gritty about the data that we collect for the program. And then we're going to give some examples of different types of scholarship projects that have come out of this program. And then finally, we're going to do a lot of talking. We're not used to doing quite so much talking, but please feel free to ask questions at any time or write them down to ask later. And we are going to we're going to have some time at the end for you to brainstorm, try to think about maybe some of the data that you could collect and some of the types of scholarship programs that you could work on. So our course transformation program, as Meg said, it's called IMPACT. I have to put the acronym up because I never remember exactly what it stands for, but it does stand for Instruction Matters Purdue Academic Course Transformation Program. Although as we've developed it, we call it a course transformation program. We've really decided it's a little bit more of a faculty development program, which seems like maybe a minor difference, but it has a lot of implications for the sustainability of the program, because we find that our program is sustained through the faculty and not necessarily through the courses that they've been for. It's a semester-long program that they participate in with a faculty development or a faculty learning community, and it has a theoretical framework based on self-determination theory, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. We have this nice little graphic that I like that kind of shows the faculty members is the center of the program. They're not being enclosed by us, but they're being supported by all of these different departments.
They look like felons from this day.
They're fellows. They're not fellows. But it really shows that the program is driven by the faculty needs and the faculty desires. So we're not really imposing any particular models or anything on them, but it's really driven by what their goals are, what they want to do with their course. The three kind of most active partners are the Center for Instructional Excellence, where I work and where Kiki worked, and then Information Technology at Purdue, that's kind of our technology branch, they come and help, and then the libraries are also. So we were the ones who kind of meet with the faculty throughout this semester-long program. We also do some of the evaluation and assessment. But we also have the Evaluation and Research Center, who does some of our external evaluation. We'll talk a little bit more about them later. And then we've got support from Digital Ed and the Office of the Provost from the administrative sides. So essentially, it's a faculty learning community. It's a picture from one of our FLCs. We meet in groups. We have support teams. So every semester, we have about 30 faculty going through at this point. And they're put into teams of about 3 faculty fellows and 3 support team members, ideally 1 from CIE, 1 from technology, and 1 from the libraries, to kind of get a different perspectives. And we meet weekly. And this is, I don't know if you can read this, but essentially this is our program. It's based essentially on backwards design. So we start with who are your students, where are you coming from, what do you really want? We spend a lot of time on learning outcomes and what do they really want their students to be getting out of the course before we get to then, okay, how are you going to know if your students have gotten what you want them to know, the assessment piece. And then finally we get to the part where they always wanted to jump into, which is, you know, what activities, what do I get to do in my classroom? Do you want to flip your class? Do you want to put it online? What are you going to do? And as you can see, it's kind of a cycle because it's iterative. We go through the semester-long program, and then we kind of send them out to do to make some changes. But we follow them for 3 years, at least 3 iterations that they teach once a year, or 6 iterations that they teach twice a year, because we know that it takes usually at least a semester, sometimes several semesters, for them to make all of their changes and to become comfortable with what they're doing in their program, because a lot of it's a learning curve. If you've been lecturing, doing purely lecturing for 30 years, and all of a sudden you're throwing in doing mostly group work in your class, that's a big change, and there's usually some growing pains. So that's something we do warn them about too. All right, just to give you an idea of the scope of the project, it started back in 2011. We had, I guess, 12 faculty fellows at that point, and it's been growing ever since. We have about 284 fellows now who've gone through the program at one time or the other. And as I mentioned, we do about 30 a semester, so 60 per year. In terms of courses, again, it started out kind of a one-to-one, mostly one-to-one, and then we kind of, you can see this big jump. Partly that's because we've had a lot more courses, but we also started including what we call impact-influenced courses. So I mentioned, what we're really seeing is that the program is sustained through the faculty. So a faculty member will go off and teach their transform course, but then they'll also apply what they've learned to another course. And so we've started including those and looking at those in our assessment and research as well. As I mentioned, our program is really based in a psychological theory of motivation. How many people have heard of self-determination theory? Okay, a lot of you. So this is a motivational theory. It's been around for like at least 40 years. It's been looked at in a lot of different countries. And it's also been looked at a lot in the educational setting. And the basis is that, we think about motivation. There are different types of motivation. External motivation, or extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, where extrinsic is you're being motivated by things outside of yourself. Intrinsic is kind of a more purely internally driven motivation. And then, of course, we have amotivation, where you don't really know why you're doing things. We include that one, too. The nice thing, interesting thing about self-determination theory is it breaks it down a little bit more. So we think of it more as a continuum from what we call non-self-determined to self-determined. And the idea is, like, if you're totally non-self-determined, you're way over here at the amotivation side. If you're totally self-determined, you're purely driven by intrinsic, like, I enjoy doing this, I want to just do it for fun. However, in education, we are very rarely driven purely by intrinsic motivation. We're interested in things, we want to do them, but, there's also a lot of external factors going on as well. And so I think what the value here is really looking at different types of extrinsic motivation along this continuum. So we have external regulation, where this is things like grades, where you're purely driven by kind of an outside force. In introjective regulation, where you're driven by feelings of kind of guilt, like I feel like I should be doing this, I don't want to disappoint others type of things. And then we get into identified and integrated regulation, where you're driven more by, the first one, you're driven more by, you're doing things because you see the value in them, you understand why they're going to be helpful to you. And then in integrated, you kind of internalize that a little bit more. So now you're feeling like, I'm going to take this statistics class because I'm a psychologist and that's something that's important for my career. So it's still it's considered in a kind of more external extrinsic motivation, but it's a little bit more internalized, and it's a little bit more what we call self-determined. So we like to put, you're going to put a line in the middle here. In education, a lot of times, we're not going to be getting people all the way up here. And these people probably are going to be dropping out anyways. But what we hope to do is get some of these people who are doing things for more external reasons and kind of push them over into this side. So at least they understand why that they have to do these things, even if they're not particularly enjoying them entirely.
Hi. Quick question. Are you motivating the faculty to change or the students to learn?
Great question. And the answer is both. So, yeah, so we use this theory both for, we present the theory to the faculty to help them think of ways to motivate their students. We also try to build it into our faculty learning community so that we motivate our faculty to participate and work in the program. So we try in most situations to model, to practice what we preach, and to give them an experience. A lot of them going through the program, it's like kind of an experience of them being in a student role, which is, I think, helpful sometimes to remember what it's like to be a student. And it's the same sort of thing. If we give you homework and then we never talk about it or never do anything like that, we never follow up with it, we never explain why it's important, we can actually use that as an example. Like, you know what, this is probably really unmotivating for you, and here's why. And here's how you can do something different with your students. So we try to be self-aware, but then we try to point out our own flaws when we make them as well. So the piece about motivation, so ideally, you know, when we were talking about student learning, we want our students to be learning. That's a very difficult thing. We can't force our students to learn. We can't get directly at that, which is why we talk about this motivation piece. But we also can't really totally control our students' motivation. So this is why I like this graphic, because it kind of shows the different layers. And the piece that we really focus on in our faculty learning community is creating a student-centered environment which will help students meet their basic psychological needs of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. I'll talk about that in a sec. And that in turn will lead to students' motivation. So this is a path that's been shown in the literature kind of again and again. And so we think by kind of hitting this top piece of the environment, it kind of trickles down, motivates students, and gets the learning outcomes that we want to achieve. So this is kind of another little diagram to look at that. So again, we're focusing here, which in turn is kind of a model, and we have some data to show that this is indeed how it works. When we talk about fostering the basic psychological needs, whenever we say autonomy, I think faculty start to get a little panicked because they imagine like a free-for-all where like faculty, students can just do whatever they want. And we reassure them that that's not at all what we mean, and actually free-for-all is terribly unmotivating for most people. So we like to talk about autonomy within a structure. And what type of structure you need really depends on who your students are. If you have first-year students new in the field, they're probably going to need a lot more structure than the seniors in a capstone course. But providing some sorts of choices where students can feel like they have a role in their learning and are not just following your total path. Competence, this is kind of what we tend to think about in classes, but building students' feelings that they're making progress towards their learning goals. And then relatedness, which is a piece that we can think about in a couple different ways. So you can have relatedness with the instructor, so feeling connected to your instructor. We did Purdue did a Gallup poll a few years ago, and one of the biggest predictors of success was whether students felt like they had a mentor at one of their faculty members they'd really connected with. So that's a big one. But we also talk about relatedness between the students and how to foster that. And we also talk about how to foster, or you can also think about relatedness in terms of the material. So getting back to that relevance piece of, I understand why I'm doing this, and it's not just for busy work. Okay, so I'm going to pass it over to Petey. She's going to talk a little bit about the data that we've collected throughout the program.
So I joined Purdue in late summer 2013. So if you remember from one of those previous graphs, at this point there were maybe 70, fewer than 100 faculty who had gone through the program. But we were at a point where we had enough data to start analyzing. And I had just finished a PhD in engineering, so I'd been married to MATLAB for the past 10 years. And they said, we have all this data and it doesn't talk to each other. We don't know what to do, we can't really analyze it. And I said, great, I got it. I can code, I'll write some MATLAB codes. And so I was able to combine all of these data sets into one giant data set so that we could analyze it. So I'll briefly walk you through what we're collecting. It comes from three main buckets, so faculty data, student data, and registrar data. From the faculty, we collect their redesign goal. And so this is, thinking of backward design, what do you want to accomplish? What are your goals for redesigning your course in this program? We collect their assessment map. So when they get to the point of having defined the goals and then talk about, how am I going to know if my students are meeting those goals, we ask them to map each of their assessments to their learning objectives. To the level of, take your exam, each question on your exam, what learning objective is that tied to? And I have a very distinct memory of working with one faculty member, and he was going through his exam, and he's like, I have no idea why I'm asking my students this question. It's not one of my learning objectives. So, gone, that question's off the exam. And so the assessment map will include everything, formative assessments, summative assessments, and mapped to a learning objective. Faculty perception, or I'm sorry, course grade books. We collect their grade books at the end of the term. Faculty perception, so that's collected from that external group that Emily talked about. So what are the faculty experiencing? And we don't want to be involved in that process because we're too closely tied to developing the program and the content and working with the faculty. So we want somebody else to manage that focus group so we can get some really honest feedback from the faculty. And so the next ones I'll go in more detail on.
Can I just ask a question about the course grade?
Yeah.
So you talked about how you have an assessment map right down to individual questions. Mm-hmm. Do you have grading information right down to individual questions? Course grade books typically aggregate across everything.
So meaning, do I have like how each student did on each question? For some faculty, yes, and you'll see an example of that later. I will actually talk about a project we did at that level.
But that's a great question because it is one of the difficulties we have run into, which is that some of them, we have a very detailed assessment map, but then getting that data that matches the assessment map doesn't always line up, or they change their exams from semester to semester.
Right. So we then also from the faculty we collect a dashboard survey, which I'll talk about in a minute. From the students, we do a student perception survey, and then of course evaluations, and I'll also talk about those more in detail in a minute. And then finally, from the registrar, we're able to collect the student demographics. So we always follow the motto of collect your data from the most reliable source possible. So if we ask students to report their birthday, sometimes it's not even accurate. They might click the wrong button or misreport. So we collect that from the registrar, their course grades, and then their student test scores, ACT, ACT, etc. So this dashboard survey, the first semester after they have gone through this redesign program, they teach their course. From that semester on, we would collect this information from them. And it was in the form of a one-on-one interview. So one of the support staff would go and talk to the faculty and ask them questions such as, okay, so what percentage of the time are you lecturing? What percentage of the time are you doing other activities? During that time you're doing other activities, what kinds of other activities are you doing? And we'll collect some detailed information about their course, and we would repeat this every term. So as you can imagine, by the time we're up to 300 faculty who have been teaching now for, starting in 2011, this becomes a bit cumbersome, and we're no longer able to do this as a one-on-one, and we now just send the faculty an electronic survey that they can fill out. So we're still capturing it, but not at the level of a conversation. The student perception survey, so I'll have you look at the handout that's in front of you. So this is the survey that the students will see. We used to send this out at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester, and it includes these 4 scales. So the Learning Climate Questionnaire is getting at what is that course environment like? What are you as a student experiencing? The Situational Motivation Scale, you'll see those questions. I believe those start on page 2. Basic Psychological Needs Scale, so this is asking questions about the autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Again, these are all their perceptions of the environment. And then the Perceived Knowledge Transfer Scale is a scale we developed. The thinking was, another outcome we would love to see is if students recognize that the material they're learning in this course applies to another course, applies to their future career plans. So how can we access some of the student perceptions on that as well? So they would receive this survey electronically. We hit that send button to 12,000 students. It's like, all right, here we go. And we would send it around week 2, and then I believe around week 8. What we noticed, though, is that by week 2, that's too late. The students already have a sense of what's going on, and so there really wasn't, it's kind of no difference really between week 2 and week 8. We weren't able to detect that change, and so we just collected the data now at the end of the term.
How do you motivate students to participate in this survey?
Great question. Some faculty give extra credit points. we encourage the faculty to explain to the students why, so motivate them. Yeah, but some do use that as credit. I don't know if there's any other ways that we. It's just
Yeah, and we get some better response rates for some courses than others.
Right.
We have some criteria for whether or not we include that data because survey research, low response rates are definitely good.
Yeah. So if we don't have a substantial response rate, we would include those data.
Do you have a sense of whether it's representative sets of students that are filling those out? Because I mean, sometimes you have just the most motivated students and then the mass.
Yep, we'll show you one of the projects we're going to talk about later. We'll have some of the demographics. In terms of demographic data, they tend to be very similar. They definitely tend to have slightly higher grades. So we're getting a little bit of the more motivated students for sure. And that's again the one of the downfalls of sort of research.
Do you have?
Yeah.
Do you collect any information that's not like multiple choice surveys, essentially, like interviews or anything like that with students to try and parse out what they actually mean by their?
Yeah, we don't, but that was in our future. It's actually in our future directions slide to get at more detail about the student experience. Yeah. Course evaluation data. So this is the typical overall. I rate this course. Overall, I rate this instructor. And then we also include SALG, so the student assessment of learning. So once the faculty have developed their learning objectives, they're required to send that to our team. And we collect all of their learning objectives and we convert those into SALG questions. So we ask the students, how confident are you that you have gained skills in the area of fill in the blank? And then they rate that on a Likert scale. So we're actually able to collect the students' perceptions of how much they're gaining on the learning objectives that the faculty are hoping that they're achieving. And then from the registrar, as I mentioned, it's demographics, course grades, and then student test scores. And now I'm going to hand it over to Emily, so we'll talk about now what we've actually done with these data.
So I like to think of the types of solid projects in kind of two buckets. One of them is essentially large-scale projects. Because we have data from essentially over 400 courses over a number of years in all different disciplines, we're able to ask some questions on a more macro level. So here's a couple of examples of questions that we've asked. So testing a theoretical model of self-determination theory and outcomes. So this is, I know it's kind of hard to see, but this is essentially our theoretical model that we were talking about before with our learning climate, basic psychological needs, motivation. This is student perceptions of learning gains, perceived knowledge transfer scale, and then also the course grade. So we can model, we can use the big data set to model our data to see how the theory holds up in a real life setting, which, spoiler alert, it does. We're also able to look at that. So we've done that, and now we're trying to explore that a little bit deeper. So some of the questions we're looking at are the role of gender in this type of model. So student gender, we're looking at the project looking at. We have a project looking at faculty gender. Does faculty gender influence students' motivation? Is that connected to student gender in any way? We're also looking at some point, we're going to look at international students and whether they it looks different for them. So we're able to look at kind of parse the data in many different ways. Even underrepresented minorities, we have a pretty small percentage of underrepresented minorities at Purdue. It's about 8 or 9%. But now that we have so many semesters of data, we still have a large enough data set that we can answer some of those questions, or start looking at them at least. This last question is the one that we're going to talk more about. But this was our question about looking at course redesign models and how that plays in a large variety of disciplines. The other type of bucket of projects that we look at are more in the micro level. So these are the individual course projects that we're looking at. So a faculty member will go through this whole process and they'll make a lot of changes in their course, and they want to know, okay, did the changes I make have an influence on student learning? Did it increase student engagement? So depending on what their goal of the course, what the goal was for the course redesign program, we're able to use some sort of research design to evaluate that. And generally, we get a lot of this pre-impact, post-impact. So, you know, here's your class before you went through impact, or while you were going through impact, we try to collect data while they're going through the program, and we beg them not to change anything while they're going through the program, although that can be more or less successful. And then we have something that we can compare that to once they've made their changes. And we can say, okay, you know, you're seeing increases on this learning outcome, or you're seeing increases in student engagement, motivation. Some programs, or some classes, actually, we do have controls and interventions. For instance, we had a program that had a whole bunch of sections, and they wanted to put some of them use what's called a replacement model, where they had less class time and more online materials. So they did that for half the sections and not the other half. And we were able to compare those to see, like, who, you know, on the same assessments, who's performing better and who's more motivated. We also have right now a large-scale grant from the Department of Education to look at this with more control. So we have a number of classes that have committed to finding some sorts of controls in order to do things within the same semester. So that's been an exciting project. And then finally, some faculty are just they're either doing a new course, or they haven't taught before, or they still want to look for some sort of change in their students. And so sometimes we look at, have the students progressed from the beginning of the semester to the end of the semester? So for instance, one wanted to see students' perceptions of environmental attitudes and whether they shifted throughout the semester. So we can help with that too. So we'll give you an example. We have one specific individual course project we can show you as well, and what that kind of looked like. But we're going to start with our large-scale project. This is the one that Kiki and I have been working on with our former postdoc Heather. And this has been a really fun project. When we first started the impact program, the idea back then was to kind of figure out what was the right teaching model, what's the best way to be teaching, and kind of help faculty develop that in all their classes. You know, there's lots of different teaching models out there. So you can have supplemental, replacement, emporium. You can have flipped. You can have a lecture style. There's so many different terms and so many different types of models. So what we tried to do was pick out some of the underlying pieces from these models and look at them specifically. And then, so what we ended up looking at was, one was contact hours. So does it matter how many hours you're spending in the classroom with your students versus putting material online? If you look at the research out there on this, it's really mixed. Sometimes people find that classes with more contact hours, students do better. Sometimes they find the opposite, and sometimes they just don't find anything.
Emily?
Yeah.
So when you say contact hours there, do you mean face-to-face contact hours?
Yeah.
So in other words, if there's an online component that will be deducted from contact hours, that's not.
Yeah, yeah. So we're talking about in face-to-face hours, essentially,
Gotcha.
in classroom hours.
Gotcha.
And it's a little bit tricky because we tend to look at it, we tend to define it as usually by a reduction, because usually people are taking a class that used to be you know, maybe 3 hours a week, and now it's 1 hour a week, and make those comparisons, if that makes sense. The other kind of variable we looked at was the presence of active learning. Yeah.
So under contact hours, was there any control for like lecture styles or types of lectures?
No, I mean, when we're looking purely at the contact hours, no, we're not controlling for what's happening during those contact hours. And that's a good point. So we tried to pull we pulled that out into a different variable, which we're calling essentially active learning. So this is getting at what you're asking, like, what are they doing in those contact hours? Are they doing active learning or not? The research on active learning, which you may be familiar with, is overall there does seem to be positive, at least some small positive effects for incorporating active learning, but it doesn't always happen. And so one of the big questions is, you know, when does active learning work and when does it not work? And how can we kind of piece that out? And so as we have been working on the program, and this is kind of before we started doing the research, we moved away from this like picking a model and helping faculty develop it. And we've moved more towards this approach of it doesn't really matter what you're doing, it's more how you're doing it. And this is the self-determination theory side of things. So you could be doing 100% lecture, you could be doing 100% active learning, but what we think really matters was whether or not you're doing it in a student-centered way. So active learning tends to be more student-centered, but it's not always. You can do 100% group work in a very controlling manner, in a really non-student-centered way. So we wanted to pull out the piece of learning climate as a separate component from active learning. So when we're looking at our research, we pulled out these separate variables. We have whether or not or how many hours they're using in their classroom. We have this active learning piece of whether or not they're doing active learning or what percentage of the time they're doing active learning. And these are both instructor reported. And then we have our student reported piece, which is the learning environments. And we can look at those on a number of different variables, including the psychological needs, the motivation, course evaluations, and then the performance piece. All right, I think we can talk about methods.
Yep, so we collected data from our students, faculty, and the registrar across 3 semesters for this current project. That resulted in 10,165 students from 190 course sections that were included in this study.
Can you say something about the array of courses?
I'm about to, yeah. The other thing I wanted to note here is that all of the data that we were collecting, we were just collecting it as we're using this to improve courses. So we were able to collect the data without IRB. When we got to the point of wanting to actually study it as a research study, we needed a historical IRB. So it was at this point that we got IRB approval to actually look at and use the data. So we have, the next few slides, I'm going to show just kind of an overview of the demographics of the college, the courses, the colleges, the students. And the thing to note is that we have quite a bit of diversity. So you'll notice we have, a couple things here to note. Our technology college was very supportive and sent many faculty our way, and so you'll see that reflected in the number of courses that went through impact from that college. But we are hitting probably almost all of the colleges are close to it. Yep. So this is the level of the course. So the program was initially designed to target those foundational first-year courses, and you'll see that reflected, that the bulk are 100 level, the large 100 level courses, but we have worked with courses from all levels. Likewise, with class size, all sorts of different class sizes were included. And something to note here, just as a side note, when we created the groups, sometimes we would actually consider class size as a way of grouping faculty together. So rather than saying we want all the physics instructors together, there were semesters where we thought, you know what, it's actually more important that they have conversations with colleagues who are teaching large 300 level courses, and so we would group them by that variable versus by their discipline. So we did play around with how we grouped our faculty. Participants, again, this is reflective of the broader Purdue population. So you'll see gender, age, ethnicity. As Emily mentioned, we have about 9% URM. And then the class level, you'll see, because we were targeting those 100 levels, 64% were in the freshman and sophomore range.
You can see we have slightly more male, which is representative of Purdue. Purdue is a very engineering-heavy school, and it has a slightly male tilt overall.
Then just to go into our study variables. So for our independent variables, so as Emily mentioned, the what is we looked at, all right, in all those models, what's being manipulated when you're looking at these different teaching models? And it's really, contact hours and then the amount of active learning. So those are our 2 what variables. And then our how variable was the learning environment as measured by the surveys. And then our dependent variables, as you saw earlier, basic psychological needs satisfaction. Again, that's autonomy, competence, relatedness. Self-determined motivation, so we collapse their responses on that scale into a number. Course evaluations, SALG, and then course grades. And then Emily's going to take us through our results.
I'm going to take you through the results fairly quickly because I have a nice summary of it at the end. But what we did was a series of regression analyses so we could look at these 3 variables together. And what we find is a pretty consistent pattern. We tend to see small effects for contact hours and active learning, but positive, at least for students' feelings of autonomy. But we see a much larger effect for the learning environment. When we look at competence, again, we see a similar one. This time, active learning did not have a significant effect, but contact hours had a small effect. And again, learning environment had a much larger effect. Relatedness, again, we see a similar pattern. Significant effects for all, but the biggest one here is in learning environment.
Can you remind me what things you're collapsing into the term learning environment? I might have forgotten.
Yeah, and when we're talking about learning
It
environment,
seems like it's important, so I'd like to understand. It seems like it's the only thing that's important.
yes, it is very important. So the learning environment is this learning climate questionnaire. It's the first scale that you have on the yellow sheet. So this is the short scale. There's a much longer scale, but we try to not overwhelm our students, so we use the short scale, which is 6 items, and it's essentially the mean.
That's one scale, or that's 6 questions with 3 disagreements?
It's all right. It's one scale, and each of them is on like a scale of a 7-point agreed, strongly agreed, strongly disagreed.
Could you say?
Yeah.
Could you remind us how you're gauging active learning?
Yeah, I don't think we actually mentioned that. We didn't put it in. So the active learning question was one that we had included on. We used to go when Kiki was talking about the dashboard survey, where we would go and talk to faculty members. We would ask them a series of questions about what they're doing in their classroom, and we would give them a number of active learning strategies, and we'd also ask them about the percentage of time that they were using lecture. And so we collapsed that into a single measure where we're looking at the amount of active learning in class. So we would ask them the percentage of time that they're doing each of these things. So it was a scale, I think, a 5-point scale where they were 0 to
24.99, and then 25 to whatever, 49.99%. So what percent of the time are you doing these various active learning? And we asked them to pick a bin so we just binned it into 5.
And so you do that through the dashboard?
We did that through the dashboard.
Yep, correct.
Similarly, the contact hours question came from the faculty perceptions of their contact
Could I
hours.
ask one question about that?
Yeah.
Did you ever do any observations to sort of see how accurate faculty were in gauging that?
That's a great question. So back when the program first started, they did some observations. I think the first semester, it quickly became unwieldy.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a great question because it's come up again and again, and we're actually working right now to try to be doing more observations again because that is the question, right? And so right now we don't have any observational data about the accuracy of this, but it's one of our future directions.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
I was just saying for this data, because the support person was doing the interview with the faculty member, the support person kind of knew how the course was running and could push a little bit on some of these questions to, sort of check with the faculty. Is that really right? So we did have a little bit of that, but it would vary depending on the relationship and how the interview was.
Right. So we still ask this question. It's one of the few that we still ask on our broad dashboard survey that we send out, but we no longer have the interaction piece, so we can't get the support team members' perceptions of that accuracy.
I think there was a question there.
Yeah.
So you might have already answered this question, but I noticed in other learning environments, like every one of these questions has the word instructor in it. So are you defining like learning environment as defined by the instructor, or is there like an additional component as to like maybe the course structure itself?
Yeah, so this is the learning environment scale is taken from the broader self-determination theory literature out there, and that's how it's been defined within the educational application. But yeah, it is really based on how the instructor is creating this atmosphere of learning environment, this particular scale, for sure. Was there another question?
Well, I was just curious about if you got, corroborative opinions from the students and the graduate student instructors, applicable, to get an independent assessment of the faculty's time expenditure on non-lecturing. I mean, you can't like train all the undergraduates in active learning when they're freshmen, right? But maybe just get some sort of idea might help.
Yeah.
Shore up those.
Yeah, we haven't done that. A lot of classes don't have graduate student instructors or they're teaching, but we do work with some of the faculty, so we have our own perceptions at least of how accurate those things are. So, but again, that's another future direction of that we're interested in following up on. Because there are definitely some limitations to instructor reported data. Yeah.
So when you say that you have your own perceptions, I mean, do you have a sense that there's an over-report, an under-report, or anything in particular that you think directionally might be variable?
I think there's a slight over-report at this point, partly because it's almost like one of those, like we shot ourselves a little bit in the foot. We've been so successful and we've been, kind of advocating for active learning, and some of the upper administration has jumped on that bandwagon. So there's been some pushes in some departments for, and this is something that we've kind of struck our head over, but like, it's really important to do 50% of your class active learning. So I think, that faculty may be pushing themselves a little bit more on that over-reporting because it's gotten that kind of perception from the administration. Although our surveys are not coming from them, so I don't know. I think that would be a great question. That's a great empirical question that we can hopefully answer by doing some observations. We've also had, and I didn't mention this, but Purdue has a new active learning center that just opened in August. So there's been, again, a big push. We have these amazing collaborative classrooms now. So it's hard to tell. Maybe there's some over-reporting. There's also now a lot more places and a lot more support for doing active learning on campus and a lot more training. So I think more faculty are doing it, and definitely more impact faculty are doing it, for sure. We do, this isn't in our presentation, we do have a kind of cool study where we're looking at that new active learning center and looking at whether impact fellows are doing more active learning more successfully in those rooms, and we're starting to see that that is the case. They're more comfortable with dealing with some of the spaces and how to use the spaces in creative ways. I'm going to keep going. This is the self-determination index. This is a single measure that we take from that motivation scale. So it has the 6 subscales for self-determined motivation, and there's a complicated formula that condenses those down into a single measure that I'm happy to provide if you're interested in that. But essentially, again, we're seeing a similar pattern where contact hours have a small effect. Interestingly, no effect for active learning, but a stronger effect for our learning environment.
I have a question about intersection between these things, right? So, yeah. Learning environment, the kinds of questions that are asked here have a lot to do with the instructor, having strong connection with you, right? So that obviously happens much more freely in small classes rather than large classes. So I can imagine that the course size could actually be a large hidden factor in this, in that you see strong learning environment measures, you also see students being happy and self-determined.
Yeah, we haven't broken down our data to look at it in different class sizes. I think that would be an interesting question to answer. I do think that they are related, kind of, you're scooping me a little bit, but I think that the reason we're not seeing more effects for active learning is because it overlaps with the learning environment. So a lot of faculty who are doing more active learning are doing it in a student-centered way. And what we're kind of trying to tease out here is that, you know, the effect is coming from here and not necessarily from that active learning piece. And I do think that could be easier to do in a smaller classroom, but again, it's a good empirical question that we haven't examined yet. Is there another question?
I think it depends on how much support or the structure of those large classes. Right. So we do have an example of a faculty member. She teaches like a 300-400 person class, but has a team of grad students, and she does a lot of active learning. You know, right? So I think there's class size definitely, and then with that, there's a lot of other factors like how much support do they have, what's the structure of the large class. So yeah, absolutely.
They're just saying many more small classes have been active for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference between.
Right.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, but not all discussion is necessarily active learning.
Right, exactly.
Right. I don't know,
Yes.
I see people all the time doing,
Yep.
they're doing discussion, but really it's like an IRE. It's like interrogation, evaluation.
Leading to a particular, yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
you know, and they're calling it Socratic, but it's like not even that, let alone active. So I guess I'm curious. So if learning environment is including, you know, is so closely tied to active learning, is it even fair to necessarily have active learning in this model if it's being subsumed by learning environment? Do you have some kind of causality to be able to say it's the learning environment that's doing that and not the active learning? Especially in light of the fact that you're not necessarily sure about the accuracy of the active learning portion of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I do think it's a separate construct, and I don't have it right here, but you know, we've run the correlations, and they are correlated for sure, but they're not that highly correlated. So there are a lot of people out there, even there's a lot of impact fellows out there, unfortunately, who are still doing active learning, but not necessarily doing it in a way that the students are perceiving as the most positive learning environment. And that might be especially, and you know, this is another question we've wanted to look at is, you know, especially that first semester when you're doing it, you may not be doing it in a very student-centered way because you don't really know how. And so when we talk about that autonomy within structure, there might be too much autonomy and not enough structure, and the students are kind of overwhelmed and don't know what's going on, right? So I think that those elements are tied, but I do think that I definitely think they're separate constructs. But yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to keep going. We got a few more. Here we've got course ratings. This is the student evaluations that students do at the end of the semester. Again, we got a positive effect for contact hours. Strangely, a very tiny but negative effect for active learning here, but a much stronger effect for learning environment. Similarly for instructor rating, this time no effect for contact hours, slightly negative for active learning, and a very strong learning environment, which makes sense, as you pointed out. The learning environment questions are very based on the instructor, so that makes sense. This is the student assessment of learning gains, so whether they feel like they're meeting the learning outcomes for the course. And again, we see a small effect for contact hours, a tiny but negative effect for active learning, and a stronger effect for a learning environment. And then finally, our last one, we look at course grade. And here we have you know, a tiny but negative effect for contact hours, a small effect for active learning, and a larger effect for learning environment. And I'm going to pull up this last slide because this is the effect sizes for all of the variables kind of shown together. Yeah.
Sorry, maybe I missed it, but I don't quite understand what you mean by positive and negative effects.
Okay, so this is we're doing a regression analysis. So positive effect means that the more active learning you have, the more learning gains you're seeing. A negative effect would mean the more active learning you're having, you're seeing actually slightly fewer learning gains. You're reporting slightly fewer learning gains. The negative things, a lot of these smaller effects we think are possibly an artifact of our very large sample size. So we have a very large sample. So you know, we're hesitant to make claims. I don't know that any of those tiny negative effects are like really, I don't think, those are necessarily the interesting part, but what we look at is the kind of overall patterns for all of these different things. And what we see is that, like, you know, contact hours, for the most part, there's maybe some small effects for having more contact hours. Active learning on its own, we're not seeing really huge effects, but we are seeing kind of across the board, you know, if you have a learning environment that students are reporting as more student-centered, we're seeing a lot of positive benefits, and it's consistent across a lot of different variables. Yeah.
So just to give some context for what these numbers actually
Yeah.
mean as far as the size goes, we can see like relative here, but what would one standard deviation in this effect size mean?
I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, these are regression analyses. They're all, even these are the large ones we have. They are kind of small to medium effect sizes, which is still pretty good for, because there's a lot of things that are going to affect. For instance, especially like we have course grade, right? There's a lot of things that go into your course grade. You can imagine. So this is technically, like, I think a small effect size according to the statistical analyses, but I think it's a significant. I think it's an interesting one, regardless, because of it is having an effect on their grade, and that's regardless of all the other variables.
So this wouldn't be like 1 on this would mean 1 letter grade or 1 step on the Likert scale.
No.
For active and for instruction rating.
No, I mean, we probably could calculate those out. We haven't really looked at it that way. But yeah, I don't know. I don't think we've ever looked at that. Yeah, calculated that out now in terms of what exactly it means in terms of standard deviation.
But like, don't the numerical, sorry, the numerical data come, so you have the survey and everything is graded on a scale of 1 to 7, and so there's your number that you start with. So do you change that into some other number?
No, we don't.
Okay, so then like a 0.3 should correspond to you're bumping it up a third of a point. So, okay, that's what we're just trying to figure out exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Let me ask another question. So you have this big pool of individual students. You have a student who was in a course, reported learning gains, they measured their learning environment, right? Mm-hmm. Then when you do the regression, do you put together all the students in all the courses?
Yes, all the students.
One big pile of students in courses.
Yeah. In this project we are doing it, yeah, we're looking at it at the student level. That allows us to include all of the students in different courses. There's some projects where we've looked at things on the course level, and that's where we get into the how many students responded. We want to make sure we get a decent response rate on those courses we throw out. We look at things on the course level. Yeah.
I think some of the negative effects in active learning resonate with me with a traditional position that students might take, where they say, group work, why isn't the teacher teaching us? I don't want to learn from other students. So a small negative, without a control group, it's hard to tell if that small negative is actually a huge gain in the positive direction. Because they feel less like group work is useless than it used to be.
Right.
So the lack of sort of, and I know why you can't do the pre and the post, but it might be interesting to get some of these questions to come in, and incoming students, before they come into Purdue, how do they feel about some of these things in general about their high school education, and map them before they have any touches.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a question, those are some of the questions we looked at more on the individual course level. So when we talk about our next project, we're able to do that a little bit more because we can see what the students said about the course when it was not necessarily.
But they're different students, right? So the idea that I was really interested in the partners you have, and the fact that you do mostly first year 100 level, it might be interesting to have someone on the new student programs team as a partner in the modeling, because that's your control group.
And actually, as you're saying this, I was thinking back, when we first started doing the program, we did encounter a lot more of that culture shock for the students. So faculty would go in and start doing more active learning, and the students would be like, whoa, what is this? I've never seen this before. As the years have gone on, and it's become much more popular at our university, and I think it's just become more popular, you know, in education in general, the students are much more on board. Like, it's not, they're not necessarily thrown, it's not like the first active learning class or the first active learning they've ever been asked to do.
I'll make one more comment and I'll hang up. When I was teaching high school, if you were teaching a college prep class, you were trying to teach it lecture style. And that was the important way, that was the way you're preparing your students for college. And now high school teachers, AP teachers, humanities, they are not expected to teach it lecture style just to prepare students for college. So there's that whole shift, I think, across the K-16.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's been a cultural shift more broadly, and definitely there's been a culture shift at Purdue in the last 6 or 7 years that we've been working on the program. Yeah.
Was there any assessment of the students of how they rated the experience of the active learning? In other words, I might like active learning, but I didn't like these exercises, which were supposed to have been active learning.
No, we haven't gone in and talked to the students about. I know a lot of individual faculty members have asked those questions, and some of them will kind of get feedback after each activity that they do to try to refine the activities. We haven't looked at that at a broad level, but I think that's definitely true, and I think that's part of that kind of refining process, why we look at it over iterations, because the first time you might try some activities that either just the activities aren't great, or you're not doing them, you didn't provide the right context for them, or you didn't debrief them well, and so there's definitely that winnowing down of figuring out how they work and what the students are reacting to them. But there's also, and I push back a little bit, because sometimes I think, student perceptions are great. We spend a lot of time looking at student perceptions. Sometimes the student perceptions can be, not overwhelmingly positive, but it's still having, a good effect on their learning. So you may not love it, and that gets back to that motivation piece. Like, even though I didn't really enjoy, it's how you ask the questions, right? I didn't enjoy that activity, but I maybe recognize that it's important in helping me develop this skill, which is going to be important for my career.
Another variable that might be interesting looking at that might tease some of this out is student effort. The same way that there is a positive effect between active learning and course grading, and a negative impact on active learning and instructor rating and course rating, I suspect the same might be true with student effort. So in those active learning cases, they may have to exert more effort. Thereby, I had to work really hard, or I wasn't comfortable. I had to exert myself, but I'm actually learning.
Yeah, that's a variable that we would love to look at, but one of the downfalls of this is that because we've been collecting this data for so long, we didn't really, even when Kiki and I started, we didn't get to be in on the ground up in terms of what data we're collecting. So, there are variables we would love to see that we don't necessarily have. I do think there's a project we're doing with the project I did with Heather at Colorado College, where we did look at effort in relation to particularly the relatedness piece, and found student effort was actually positively related to relatedness with the instructor. So the more you feel like you're connected to the instructor, the more effort you're going to put into the course. Which makes sense, but it was actually distinguished from relating with the student. So I might really connect with my peers, but I may not work harder in the course. But if I connect with my instructor, I am going to have an increase in that effort. Yeah.
You might actually have some effort data, at least from student perspective, on the ratings forms. Because if there's a question about how much did you, what was the level of work that you put in, depending on how it's framed and all kinds of things like that. Some research has suggested that counterintuitively more work and is positively correlated with overall evaluation. So it would be interesting to look at that, as well as some other variables, depending on the extent to which it's on the rating form or not.
It's a great question, because we do have, I looked at the Pisces, the question, there's like 600 questions that faculty can choose from, and there probably are some that look at that effort. So we just have to dig deep into which courses included those questions. But
it's often the workload of this course was sort of graded.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's kind of I can't think of the word, but a mine of data that we haven't really dug into yet. Is we haven't gone in the student evaluations beyond those two kind of main questions in the South, but that's future directions.
One more question
Yeah.
about this data set. This is including instructors who've been doing this anywhere from 1 semester to 6 semesters, correct?
Well, yeah, so this data set is it's only 3 semesters, so this is a subset of our larger data set. It's because, partly because we started working on this project a few years ago, and partly because, we just wanted to pick out, this is the semester that we had some good dashboard data from, or the 3 semesters. So it's, but yes, it includes people who have been, it includes actually some baseline data too. So we did not distinguish between faculty who are currently going through the program and faculty who have been teaching it for 3 semesters. So that, again, that we would love to be able to answer definitively, like faculty pre to faculty post. We tried to look at that on a broad scale. It's a tricky thing. But in this project, we did not distinguish. Yeah.
Thank you for taking time to answer our data and ethics questions.
I love it. I mean, I love to talk about research questions and methods. So.
It's very hard. You're doing a good job. I'm sure you want to move on to other things. I have one small one. In these slides, and you can answer this yes, no, are these the 3 independent variables that are in your model, or are you modeling other life control variables at the same time? Or is those the 3 for every dependent variable that existed?
These are the 3.
Just
so
3 and then the dependents.
Yeah.
And those are all those slides. Okay.
Yeah, we did not control for anything else in this in these analyses.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so okay, you're going to talk quickly implications. Yeah,
and also, just to, we can't go back in time and change anything. You haven't started yet, right? So please, take the questions you're directing at us. I'm reflecting them back and write them down so that you can collect this data, right? And learn. This was our stab at course transformation in 2011, when things were just getting started. Learn from this so that at least we feel like this is benefiting, right? So I'm reflecting those back onto your paper, and think of ways that you can perhaps address these issues as you move forward. So remind you of a slide we showed you earlier. So what we're seeing is, again, focusing on that student-centered environment, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, using that to affect learning outcomes. And so what does this mean? Again, really make your classroom student-centered, and how can you do that? So we're going to highlight some ways in which you can foster autonomy, competence, and relatedness. This is not all-inclusive, but just, again, to get you thinking, right? For autonomy, maybe even give your students a voice in the classroom policy, or one small piece of it, so they feel like I had some choice. Maybe they can choose their final projects. Some level of autonomy. Provide options on assignments. That could also be, so when I teach an engineering design course, my students do a written assignment, an oral presentation, but I also have them do a video, a 1-minute video. And this is a way that maybe those students who are feeling more creative or want to communicate in that way, they can really shine on that assignment. Explain the rationale for using active learning on the first day of class. I think we're finding consistently the first day of class is so important, especially when you're doing something new. So get the buy-in. Explain to your students. The students want to know why. Why do you want me to do this? It ties back into motivation. Fostering competence. Low and high stakes assignments that require reflection. So have the students think about, what could I do differently next time? This ties into the growth mindset. Making sure that you're providing feedback to all of your students, and frequently. Maybe you didn't get an A. Here's why, though. Here's what you would need to do next time to reach the bar. And describe how learning is assessed and use rubrics. So being clear with your students, if I know what I need to do in order to perform well in this class, I'll feel competent. So you're fostering that sense that I can do this. I understand what's expected of me. I'm not trying to read the instructor's mind. And then for relatedness, include some get-to-know-you activities. So again, this ties back into that first day of class. Really set the stage for your students. You know, if you want your students to do group work, make sure on the first day of class you're doing some kind of group work. They take cues, right? They're trying to figure you out, like, so what's this person like? You know, what's this class going to be like? To the extent that you're comfortable, share personal anecdotes that the students can connect with you. Of course, all of this should be overlaid on your persona as an instructor and your comfort level with these things. You don't want to try to do something that is not true to who you are as an instructor, but you know, to the extent that you can, share personal anecdotes and encourage students to talk to each other and not just to you. So peer feedback, peer instruction. I have my students do peer feedback on some drafts of their papers, and then the comments I'll get is one group is like, we're really behind. We saw the other group and we, you know, get going. Or the students will give each other feedback. Well, I never would have thought of that, right? And they're pushing each other. And I had one group that did way more than I may have expected them to do because their peers were kind of like, what about this? What about this? So leveraging that. And then, yeah.
So one quick thing, I appreciated your comment about not doing something that doesn't fit with your personal style, but one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is that people have different identities and backgrounds, and are therefore perceived in different ways based on the body they inhabit. And so some things that might be more successful for a white male faculty member might be more problematic for a woman in the sciences, for a faculty member of color, or things like that. And so that seems to me to be somewhere in the mix as well.
Yeah, and I don't think have we addressed that, or is there work?
No, I mean, it's one of the future directions we're interested in is looking at instructor gender and on some of these outcomes. But it's also one reason we've kind of always in the back of mind, like people want to do kind of like us to do a recipe book, like how do you do this? How do you create a student center? And we haven't been able to do that because, as you say, I think it depends on the instructor. I think the way you can do it in many different ways, and you have to do it in a way that is authentic to your own identity.
And thinking of case studies rather than recipes might be an interesting way to think about that. But there might be a lot of different ways to do it, and who you are, your style, who you are, might all.
And that's what we've been toying with the idea. We've been talking about the idea of doing a qualitative interview study where we interview a bunch of faculty who are succeeding at creating a student environment and get some of their not just what are you doing, but how are you doing it and how does it relate. So that's a project that we've been talking about for a little while, but haven't yet managed to get started.
So just to put one little more, it's something that came up on our professional listserv, is the extent to which undercutting authority is seen as building student-centeredness, whereas undercutting authority can be really problematic for people who come into the classroom where students are granting less authority in the first place. So there are interesting dynamics there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, one of the pieces, like that comes up a lot with the course evaluation, debate that's always going on. We're having a debate at Purdue right now about they're overhauling the course evaluations because of issues with biases. And one thing we've been trying to push for is putting something like the learning climate questionnaire on it, because it gets away from like, do I like this instructor, which can have more of the, your unconscious biases tapping into, it's my psych background, but your unconscious biases tapping into that, whereas like if you can get these questions, I think are a little bit less prone to some of that, so it could be interesting to use more broadly.
I was just saying, as a follow-up to that, usually you had less, if your N was smaller, you'd have to like control for all these different identities of students and instructors and class size. You can control for all that in your regression, but with your sample size being so large, is you can actually run all the same analyses and you probably use the same code just with the instructors that are women, just in the classes that are just. You said you had 9% of your population was students of underrepresented groups. That 9% is like a sample size of 1,000, so you could just focus on them. So you don't have to redo a lot of work. It's just cutting people out of the sample, and so that's low-hanging fruit. I don't know everything you did behind the scenes. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
You're lucky with a huge sample.
And that's what we're kind of getting into now. So now that we've kind of looked at these things more broadly, we can start to answer some of those questions about different identities and different types of classes and all that.
So this slide, I think we've covered. So we'd like to do interviews with faculty and understand what they did and how they achieved that high learning environment. Collect student reports, face-to-face class time and amount of learning. So what are the students perceiving? We hit that one. And course observations, so yeah. Success. Verify student instructor reports. I'll go through, I will go through now an individual course project. So we sort of alluded to this at the beginning. We were going to give you an example of a big project that we worked on, and then one at the course level. So this is one that I've been involved in, the redesign of an introductory macroeconomic course to emphasize higher order learning. So this is typical, mostly first years and sophomores, a large class, 250 to 350 each semester, and it satisfies a requirement. So you will have students who are taking that to satisfy a requirement. It was redesigned in fall 2013. As a note, this instructor was on sabbatical, so you're going to be like, how do you do so much work? He was on sabbatical, so he had the time to redesign and overhaul this course. But this was his epiphany. Don't ask what you want your students to know, ask what you want them to be able to do. And for him, this really was like, this revolutionized how he approached his course. So before impact, you'll notice that the learning outcomes are, learn, what does it mean to learn? And most of his are just that the students are going to learn about all these things, but it's not very clear what that actually means if I've learned. And he kind of said, you're just going to recognize economics when you see it. That's his approach. So during impact then, he found it really useful to have to write down the 8 key skills or activities that students should be able to perform after completing the course, and the 8 key content understandings that students should have. He particularly liked Bloom's wheel as a way of helping him pull out some of these verbs that are associated with what he wants his students to be able to do. So after impact, you'll notice now the learning outcomes are much more specific, student-centered, clear, so students can analyze, describe the condition of the economy, predict the results. You'll also notice these are shifting up to higher order, right? Predicting, analyzing, these skills that require more cognitive energy. And his overarching goal then after impact is that students, instead of just recognizing economics when you see it, they'll be able to apply the knowledge of economic measurement, the economic model, and the history of US economic policy to analyze economic events, personal and global. So what happened? This is an example I mentioned earlier at the exam level. So this instructor was very meticulous in his record keeping. And so he had data on every single exam question. And he rewrote his final exams, but he was able to keep some of the same questions before the redesign and after the redesign. So he was able to reuse some of these questions, and those were the questions that we were able to look at for this study. So spring 2012 and fall 2012 was before the redesign, and so we analyzed his exam and we categorized each question. And so about 70% of his exam was at the low 1 and 2 Bloom's level. 3 and 4 was only about 30%. And then he had them read some articles, so real world application, but that only accounted for 2% of the exam questions in spring 2012 and none in the fall. So you'll notice after the redesign, you'll see the shift. So 1 and 2 is now down to just under 50%, and the exam questions that are targeting the higher level Bloom's taxonomy are up just above 50%. And then even higher in fall of 2014. You'll also notice that he included more articles, so forcing students to apply what they're learning to real-world examples. So then what we did is we said, all right, what percentage of students got each of these questions correct before the redesign, and what percentage of students got them correct after the redesign, and what's the difference that we're seeing? So remember, before the redesign, he was kind of emphasizing these lower order skills, and after the redesign, he was emphasizing higher order. So interestingly enough, after he redesigned his course, students actually did worse on the lower order questions. So they may not remember all the specific terminology, they may not remember all the details, but they did better on the higher order questions. The one question they did worse was a question in which if you didn't have the factual memorization down, you couldn't answer the question. But for the other ones where it really was just analyzing, predicting these higher order skills that we would really want our students to walk away with, they did better on those questions. So this is a really clear example of at the course level how you can detect these changes.
So is each of these bars a different individual question?
Correct.
Okay. That's,
yep. And the ones in blue are statistically significant.
And this for him was like this is actually a really positive result for him. I mean, it was interesting. It's an interesting demonstration of kind of trade-offs. So like you're going to focus more on higher order questions. Your students are going to be doing better at that, but that's less time that they're spending on this lower order stuff. But for him, because this is a non-major course, you know, that's what he really wanted his students to take away was being able to analyze. And so it was okay with him if they didn't remember what GDP stood for.
Right, because he knew that when they're citizens of society later on, not as econ majors, right, they can do some of these, they understand these higher order.
What is the gray versus blue in here?
Gray is just not statistically significant. Okay. So he was really excited. I'm really excited about this. And then his course evaluations. So you'll see his first post-impact class, it all kind of crashed a little bit. But you'll notice that his instructor rating rebounded, his course rebounded. But interestingly, think critically as above where he was before. And that was one of his evaluation questions, right? His course evaluations, I think he had a question about thinking critically.
And this is an interesting one too, because this is someone who'd been lecturing for 30 years. He's a really engaging lecturer.
Yeah.
So exactly. It's not like he was obviously beforehand he was getting
up
really
in the high fours.
Right. Out of 5. He was doing really well. Although as he points out when he talks about this, you can see it was kind of creeping down. His students are getting a little bored. He's getting a little bored, which is partly why he ended up going through impact. And then he got not only just students but he is so much more energized around his course and excited. So, but he likes to say, we did warn him that it might be a transition, and so he didn't freak out when his course evaluations plummeted.
Is this a sort of typical experience for your faculty? Do you tend to see them?
It tends to be difficult when they do as much as he did in one semester. So again, as Kiki mentioned, he was on sabbatical. He totally revamped his course. It was completely different. And so when they do that much at once, I think this can be fairly normal because it's a big change and it takes a little bit of finessing.
But and I've also the other approach is to just do 10%. So I'll also hear in faculty development circles don't try to do what he did, but just try to change 10%. You may not see that drastic dip if you're just doing a little bit each time.
Do you prepare your faculty for that potential?
Yes. Yeah, we do. Yep.
Yes, you may have mentioned this, I'm sorry if I missed it, but what is the percentage of the faculty who've been through impact who are tenured versus not tenured? And is there is there an institutional kind of buy-in in terms of if you do see these dips and evaluations, is there some understanding in terms of their file and that kind of thing?
That's a great question. We were talking to Heather about this earlier. Do you know the numbers though?
I don't know the numbers. We tend to we try to not target assistant pre-tenure faculty for a particular reason. Partly because of this, but also partly because even though Purdue is pretty supportive of teaching, there are certainly departments where it's not prioritized, and this takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. And so we don't want them to be doing things that are not going to be beneficial and prevent them from getting tenure. So we target post-tenure faculty.
If I'm reading that correctly, that's actually a pretty quick bounce back. I mean, because the drop is that first iteration where it was going down, and then is that right that the next time it was offered, it went up in a pretty big way?
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I will say this highlights, and Heather, we were talking to Heather about this earlier as well, is the importance of support. So, faculty go through this program, right? But it's crucial to maintain that support with them afterward. Because you may try things and get discouraged, and if you don't know what to do next and don't feel like you have somebody to talk to or bounce ideas off of and be reassured that it'll be okay, you could just go back and say, forget it, I'm just going to go back and do what I was doing before. So we find that because we follow faculty for 3 years, so I would email my faculty, then, how are things going? Can I meet with you? Can I check in? You know, so that being proactive on the support side of things is really important. And I know that there's some research elsewhere showing that, you know, the barriers are always going to be there. Time, money, you know, you can't get rid of those barriers, but you can counteract them with high levels of support and to really focus on the positives. Tend to get better outcomes for faculty development programs.
What is that dotted line?
That's the course.
That's the course evaluation. So overall, I rate this course as.
Okay, gotcha.
We have a pretty big longitudinal set there. If you actually did just fall, it'd be a pretty smooth line.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much, it's so rhythmic for the year.
We see that in a lot of courses, is that some courses have very different student populations in the fall and spring. So sometimes when we're looking at these individual course projects, we'll only look at fall because that's the on semester, especially with math classes, that's the on semester. If you're taking in the spring, it's because you either failed it or you transferred in or there's something weird about you. So we want to look at the on course, the on semester for those particular courses.
All right, so I'll hand it over to Emily. So this gets into the more interactive portion.
Yes, we're finally going to.
Although it has been for
get you to talk. If you have more questions, we'll walk around during these discussions, and also we'll be here afterwards. But we're now going to throw it back to you, just to give you a little bit of a setup. This is a nice. It's a little bit tiny. Sorry, a graphic I stole from Minnesota, but. We talk about we have a lot of research projects going on, but there's a lot of different kind of ways that you can look. You can use this, and you can do kind of a full-on scholarship of teaching and learning down here, which is some of the projects we're doing. But even just the process of going through this, can be considered scholarly teaching. So using the process of asking a question, consulting literature, trying something out and seeing what works. You can do it on lots of different levels. We try to encourage all of our faculty to do this. They don't all end up into scholarship projects like Larry's, but some of them do. And the others, we still try to kind of to prime them with this. And so that's what we kind of thought could be helpful for you. And do we have a handout or a worksheet or something? Yep. Hold on. Okay, great. So we're going to get you, and we're going to get you to start thinking. The first question we want to think about is your research question, or it doesn't have to be a research question. You can think of it just as an inquiry. So if you're going to be teaching, you're going to be making changes. What are you interested in investigating?
What are you curious about? What do you want to know about your course?